we can be in better position when we do have the contractor on board.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Joey. I view this as an initial conversation among ourselves, just to start the process of identifying what we think the major equity impacts are of the ideas under consideration so far, and also what we have in mind to discuss with regard to mitigation, design features and mitigation measures. So it's just a conversation to advance the ball so that when we do sit down with the equity consultants and go through, the process will be further along.
That's great. It just was very bare bones agenda, so helpful for a little bit more of your thoughts on what that will look like. I think I agree it'll be helpful.
Okay, I mean, we recognize that this is part of our doing our homework to get ready so that we can work more effectively with our consultants and go through that process. Now back to the minutes from last time. Any corrections that anyone would like to suggest to the minutes? Okay. All right, hearing none, we will deem the minutes to have been approved. And I can note, I thought that the minutes were fine and accurately represented what happened at the last meeting. Jane, I think it's over to you to lead us through a conversation about the drafting process. And one of our goals today is just to make sure that we have our assignments clearly in mind, and that all the major portions of the plan that involve this subcommittee are well in hand.
Good afternoon, everybody. Nice to see you all. It was nice to see many of you yesterday in person. Thanks to Jared for such a wonderful day. I thought maybe I would just pick up for 1 second on, oh, Jared has his hand. So Jared, why don't you go first before I go into a spiel?
Thanks, Jane. And I'm sorry I wasn't as quick on the draw as I meant to be on the minutes question. And I would just suggest a friendly clarification, if it's still possible, to minimize any confusion. There's the section about the transportation sector recommendations. And I think the minutes right now say joining TCI. I think for clarity, it's important that as I understood them, the Transportation Task Group recommendations were joining the TCI program versus just the Transportation and Climate Initiative discussion group, which has been around for 10 years plus. So I think it would be helpful clarity to add to the minutes, joining the TCI program, not just joining TCI.
Any other comments? That
makes sense.
Okay, then we'll make that one change to the minutes. Thanks, Jared.
Okay, thank you. So just a little bit of an update from the council meeting first, because before we move into drafting, just want to speak a little bit to prioritization briefly, and how it relates to your conversation you're going to have about equity today. I have been, as we're moving through and anxiously awaiting signing the contract with the equity consultant, I have been starting to anticipate that contract will be signed hopefully in the next few days. And so I have set up, I just want to let you all know that we have a meeting set up with the co-chairs of the 5 subcommittees for next Wednesday with the equity consultant to be clear about expectations and process, and try to come to an agreement amongst the subcommittees, especially in thinking about like the support that they'll be given and the expectation around further analysis of actions that might be needed independently. There's been some questions around, will the consultant support us through analyzing all of our actions? Will they support us in a subset and then expect that we will do it all? In my conversations with them yesterday, it has felt like it's evolving a bit in my mind. I had been a lot thinking about that in no way that in a group meeting that we would be able to sort through all of the actions using the scoring rubric. So had been really thinking about it as an elevation of a suite of actions that you recognize are likely going to be proposed as implementable in the foreseeable future, so prioritized for action. And then second, ones that really are like in your professional judgment, you can tell need a dialogue and conversation in this space. And so I think today's conversation helps you get to that. In my conversation since we spoke with the council around prioritization and then subsequently with the equity consultant, I'm starting to think, and I feel badly that you guys are all sort of like along for the ride as we develop this process in real time. But the prioritization conversation, which I anticipate will be finalized through some dialogue with the steering committee on Tuesday, the 5 foundational criteria, which we have agreed to use for the analysis of actions, and then rather than sorting ready to implement and further development, think about how we use that to prioritize an implementation schedule for the actions coming together. Thinking that there may be some initial screening of those using the 4 of the criteria minus equity as the 5th, that helps you think about the impact of your actions and the ones that you'll likely move forward with first and foremost. This may be a little mute for cross-sector because the recognition that your actions need to make a cumulative impact to 2025 and be on your way to 2030. But I think this is really important for rural resilience and ag and ecosystem, which have cumulatively, hundreds of actions. And so a recognition that a prioritization and what they want to drive as those immediate actions will be relatively important for having what they spend the time and space investing in an equity conversation in and around. And what we do with the rest, that's where I'm starting to not recognize that time and capacity may be of the essence. And the conversation with the equity consultant and the co-chairs next week will hopefully flesh out if the expectation is all actions are ranked through the scoring rubric, or there's an implementation schedule about how we will further apply the scoring rubric in the coming months as we think about implementation. So I say all of that just because I recognize it's so timely as we're all thinking about how to put forward our actions to the full council in the coming weeks, and just to know that things are evolving and the space of how we do this well. But I really hope that as of next week, some clarity will come to the conversation around application of equity, as well as a clear and consistent process for how and the timeline for prioritization. So I'll pause there, answer questions like Christine's, and then want to say that I'll shift into talking about the CAP drafting process, which I've done some revisions since the council meeting on the draft. Is not at all final or revised. And then what I didn't share with the council the other day was a more detailed CAP outline, which we had with all of your names next to certain sections with staff to support you. So we'll go through that briefly and look at the timeline and expectations. Christine?
So thank you, Jane. That was super helpful, and it was a lot of words for my brain. So I'm wondering, as a CSM subcommittee member, what is it that you just asked me to do in a sentence or two, please, if anything?
Yeah, the expectation with prioritization is that you will sort your actions amongst, for you all, your sectoral work, and then because that is how it is distributed in the CAP outline by sector, not rolled up. You will put them through the prioritization, which is the 5 criteria, and rank them based on an implementation schedule.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And when is that to be done by, roughly?
Yeah, that's the part that it will not be done for your presentation on October 5th, but it will certainly be done around then.
Okay, thank you.
It will be important for this committee to be able to tell the full council, at least to a significant degree, here are the high priority items that we believe that the climate action plan will need to contain and will need to prioritize. And we're doing that. We've been doing that all along at a fairly high level of generality, I'd say. But if we were to take our recommended actions and screen them according to the 5 high-level criteria, and then it's somewhere before too long, screen them again according to the equity considerations again, then I think we'd be in a good position to prioritize our recommendations to the full council. But we have a pretty good head start on that already.
So quick follow-up, if I may. At some point, there will be mitigation strategy results coming back or findings coming back from Cadmus/EFG. And presumably that will inform our prioritization. Is that another round of prioritization above and beyond the 2 you've just described? And in what sequence are you guessing or believing those 3 rounds will happen?
Yeah, thanks, Christine. So the prioritization, the 5 foundational criteria include impact or progress towards the GWSA requirements. So in this space, it's emissions reductions for the recommendations that you're putting forward. Those will be done, and that is flagged to be presented to you all next week. The bulk of the cross-sector meeting next week will be a presentation and discussion with the consultants around their final analysis of the pathways. That will be the way we have it in the prioritization for impact or progress is high, medium, and low. I think that where and when that is quantifiable, especially for cross-sector, that will just give you more analysis to utilize in your prioritization. So yes, I hope it will be folded in simultaneously as you're reviewing your criteria.
So can I try saying
it'll
this
be ready.
back in a couple sentences to see if I've heard it, how to net out from a committee member point of view, operationally, what you're asking me to do. Next week, I'll learn what the consultants think roughly at a high, medium, low level-ish of what the impacts of various mitigation strategies will be. That will then inform the work that I do with Dave and whoever else on or around or after 10/5 for a first round of prioritization using the 5 foundational prioritization criteria. And then at some point later, the results of that will be sorted again with the equity frame once the equity consultant is on board. Did I get that right?
Yes or no? Yes, like mostly.
Christine, I think you got that right. And I would also add that the equity screen will help us to bear down on design issues inside of initiatives and mitigation measures that we would want to prioritize. Even within a high priority item, we have to make decisions about high priority design elements within a subject area. And the equity screen will help us when we're choosing those recommendations. We're refining the recommendations in more depth. So, but I would say you've sketched it out properly. And
Thank you.
Can I just say one thing?
Oh, Ginny. Yeah, Ginny.
I think we shouldn't forget that we can think about equity while we're developing we don't need to wait for this consultant. I mean, we're doing our program, give them a recognition on that, not wait. We have this consultant, number one. Number two is when do we wrap in public involvement? Or is that something we cross our fingers and hope they agree with us? Or when do we, I don't want to be smart ass about it, but when do we get that stuff? And when do we wrap it in?
So the public engagement will be presented as a synthesis to the October 12th Climate Council meeting. So that is sort of like the bulk of the synthesis to be finalized on October 12th. You'll have it then. You are presenting your preliminary suite of pathway strategies and actions on October 5th. And based on the timeline, it's roughly a month from when you will finalize your actions and roll them in. So you will have the public engagement in October. We don't have the public engagement as a specific criteria to prioritize with, but certainly you'll have feedback and you'll use it with professional judgment to incorporate.
Okay, so the council will do that now.
Well, the council will
It's
hear
the
it. I haven't,
council
sorry, you're
get
breaking
a
up. Gina.
report and then decide based on. No, sorry.
I think you should
So
maybe
the
go off
council
video,
will,
possibly.
I gotta go in the other. Yeah, I gotta get closer to my router. This always happens up here in the Northeast Kingdom.
Well, what I'll say is,
Okay.
we have not spoken specifically to our engagement consultants about expectations with rollout to the subcommittees and specific engagement, but I firmly expect that will be a component of how they expect to present their work. I think Ken Jones has some really good music on in the background. Yeah, okay, thanks.
Okay.
You gotta love Johnny Cash.
Thanks, Jane. Dave, you had your hand up and now it's down.
So Rich, just to observe that through this process, we've come up, when we first came up with a list of what we thought were good recommendations, we've broken some of those out and we've prioritized things over the time that I've been on this subcommittee. So I guess I'm thinking out loud, if we come up with a list that's going to be further winnowed, do I add back all the things that I think maybe we shouldn't be considering and not just keep the ones that I think are absolutely important? I'm going to answer that. No, I'm not going to do that, but I want you to understand that we've done some of this process already. So I hope I don't get more of a haircut. I need a haircut, but I don't want to get a haircut here.
Thanks, Dave. I think understood.
We didn't put on the schedule today to talk about prioritization, and we probably should have. I haven't refined it. I haven't had time to refine it like closely since the conversation with the council. That said, one of the first steps that we proposed was a consolidating of pathway strategies and actions with that professional judgment. That is definitely happening at subcommittees, and that was a great example, David. And so others have been doing that, and I hope and that will happen first and foremost before you run through prioritization. So I think next week it would probably behoove us, based on like having the conversation with CADMIS and EFG about the sectoral analyses, perhaps we can use that to really refine and talk about the prioritization that would then move forward at that point. So we can plan to do that next week more closely. And then we would also be informed about a more detailed timeline with the equity consultant and how that work fits in with all of you. Okay. Hearing no other questions, or maybe just trying to quickly dodge any other questions, I will share. Too many things open. Okay, so on Tuesday with the Climate Council, after a lot of sort of false starts and different processes, thinking about how we present and roll out the CAP, recognizing that December 1st is coming quite fast, thinking about how we put together a comprehensive CAP that not only ensures us meeting our timeline, but also ensures that counselors can see themselves in the process, have primary drafting roles where it makes sense and where they have capacity, but also specifically think about how state staff can support them. I will say that, there's been a lot of conversation about cap drafting, and partially it's been, there hasn't been a clear articulated plan about how we're going to move through these components this fall on a schedule. And so I'm hopeful that after Tuesday's conversation, people feel assured that we have a plan and people can get on board with the components that are being proposed for them, and as well as subcommittees and state staff. I will also say that I haven't refined the outline in great detail since then, but I did make some changes to it based on the consensus that we were able to reach with how we want to move and prioritize actions, as I was just speaking to. It's not fully refined. Actually, Marianne and I are going to talk a little bit about this afternoon and work towards putting forward a new draft for the steering committee next week. But what I was hoping that we would focus on specifically for you all today is cross-sector mitigation section of the CAP, and then look at the timeline related to that so that you can see what's expected of you all individually, speak to any concerns that you have, and then look at the timeline to understand when these different components will be to the council for oral feedback. You'll see that on the schedule, there's a few days after the council meetings for written feedback, and then a week turnaround for how to illustrate revised drafts and responses to the comments that you receive. In addition, I'll just say that, oh my God, my email just keeps driving me crazy. I'm gonna close it. The components here, we've also identified more direct roles and coordination needed, we hope, with a subset of counselors to think about how we deal with cross-cutting ideas and themes that are coming out of all of the subcommittees in a thoughtful way in the CAP, as well as how we think about a framework for implementation and that real synthesis that needs to happen at the end. So that's not just state staff providing drafts to the council. There's a cooperative nature in that moving forward. So that plan and selection of counselors will hopefully be finalized by the end of this week. And we're hoping that counselors who lean into that work will represent the different buckets of work to bring expertise in mitigation, but also in resilience, adaptation, and sequestration and equity. So you'll see, I think many people saw this, or there's a different version, I should say, online, and I'll share this with you all via email. But really, when we get down to pathways, the pathways for mitigation, as I just suggested, we are not rolling it all up into pathways for mitigation. We plan to keep it by sector. I think a good suggestion a while ago is that we should lead with the bigger contributions of emissions. So to lead with the transportation, buildings, I have electricity next in support of those two, but we can talk about if non-energy goes after that, and then electricity is sort of at the end. But we also have a section at the beginning where we'll frame and provide a high-level summary of the body of work across all of these sectors. And that's really, Marion and I, likely myself in this space, will support, I'm hoping Rich and Peter write that. This was pushback on the council. I had automatically put co-chairs into this role. Doesn't have to be. If other people on the subcommittee want to lean in, or Rich and Peter don't want to do that, it was just a starting place. So that's one area to speak about. But then under each of these sections, you'll see the task leads and a key staff person that will help with drafting and some of the templates and other components of those sections. So my hope is that, like Dave and Christine, if that really the compilation of the spreadsheet and compilation of the work and support and sort of direction that you've been providing to date is as far as you want to go, hopefully Brian can really lean in and help you turn that into words and sections for the CAP. So it's really as much, and I know Liz and Ed, your section has felt more manageable, and since much of it will come from what's being drafted for the comprehensive energy plan, there hasn't been as much of a critical need to find staff support, but there are people if you would like it. And then I'll just say that the agriculture section, I've left with the task lead for Ag and Ecosystem, who's been working on this section with the staff support Justin's been providing to Ryan Patch. And then, of course, we have Peter Walk and Marion here. So Peter Walk and Colin for non-energy. And finally, I'll just say the mitigation pathway for rural communities. For now, I have Marion plugged in here, and that's because Marion's been supporting the pathway group. One of the 5 pathways in rural resilience is really focused on this. And they've been really kind of on their own, not on their own, but Marion has been urging them to like pull in ideas from cross-sector, but they've sort of been they have been drafting their own mitigation pathways. And this is something that is going to need some coordinated discussion so that we're recognizing that we're providing additive value in this section about modifying pathways from other areas and speaking to some gaps that we might have missed, but really don't want to just be repeating ideas that are already covered in the other sectoral sections. And then finally, I'll just say,
Jane,
yeah, go ahead.
I have some fairly significant concern about the bringing up of additional pathways that are outside of the process that we've used to develop them.
Yes, I do too. I don't get it.
Okay, so there is a specific charge in rural resilience and adaptation and around tailoring mitigation pathways to speak to rural communities. And there's been I think a minor, a small attempt to try to pull in cross sectors work to tailor it, but rather than that, what has happened is it's a single pathway. It's not multiple pathways. It's not plural, but it's really around strategies or actions, I should say, for rural communities to ensure they're contributing and being supported to meet emissions reductions. But it may be that it's just a section altogether that is revised or summarized based on the other sections that are already written here. And before people jump in with critique or questions, I want to make sure Marion really has been leading this with rural resilience and make sure I'm characterizing it right and have Marion speak to some of the concerns and questions that she's already posed with this group.
Yeah, so just a bit more background. As Jane said, in the Global Warming Solutions Act, the Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee is charged with developing best practices for rural communities to reduce emissions across municipalities, schools. I'm blanking what the other ones are. They've expanded it to look at sort of the municipalities, utilities, schools, public institutions, hospitals, using the MUSH acronym. They're not trying to step on the work of cross-sector, but understanding that that's the charge from the Global Warming Solutions Act, and that this subcommittee is really focused on rural communities and supporting rural communities in that transition to electrification, in the transition away from fossil fuels. They've been trying to think about what programs and ideas should be in place to help rural communities make that transition. We totally agree and think that there needs to be coordination across cross-sector, and I will say that Chad is on that group as a liaison from cross-sector, although I don't see him on the call today. And we would welcome coordination with cross-sector to do that work, but understanding that that is a specific charge in the Global Warming Solutions Act for the subcommittee to think about as the proposed strategies and actions coming out of cross-sector around electrification, moving away from fossil fuels, that there needs to be some real focus on how that impacts rural communities and how they can better be prepared for that transition. And that's what the group is really trying to focus on.
I'll tell you, in transportation, we never once thought of rural communities as anything separate. I mean, I'm sitting in a rural community and I thought I was here because I'm representing a rural community. And maybe this is another evaluative criteria for us to make sure we're including rural communities. We shouldn't have one group giving one set of recommendations around mitigation and another group giving another set. It just doesn't make it. It'll weaken our argument. So maybe for those areas that rural communities wants to get into mitigation, we sit down and talk to them about what we're coming up with.
Yeah, and I think that would be a good way forward. And the
We
intent
never-
is to not propose separate mitigation actions. It's really, we're hoping to take what cross-sector is proposing and be able to build on that. I think part of the issue is we just haven't, last week was the first time I saw actions from cross-sector. So they've been trying to work in that process, understanding that cross-sector is still working on those specific actions that they can look at for impacts on rural communities. So yeah, I don't think they need to be proposing them separately either. I don't think that's a good process, but yeah.
Yeah,
I think this is one where substance may clarify things, right? When we see what the discussions are and see if there's really, I don't think there's going to ultimately be that much disconnect. I think it's more of a framing issue than anything else. I just want to make sure that we highlight that as a area that we should revisit as we get more data.
Joey?
Agreed, Peter, and I would recommend that we make sure that maybe through Marion initially, but that we connect with whoever is coming up with those. The way you described it, Marion, it's approaches or strategies that rural communities can use to implement or to deal with mitigation opportunities, which is somewhat different from what those mitigation opportunities statewide need to be. And statewide obviously includes rural communities. And I agree completely, we should not be developing them in two separate silos. Cross-sector is named cross-sector for a reason.
I was going to say something very similar. So I guess I would just say, yeah, because we've been thinking about it, just like we've been thinking about equity in all of how we can shape these different proposals to be more equitable. Like the stuff we're putting on the table, we're thinking about it through a rural lens, through an urban lens. So, but one question I have for you, Marian, is there something more specific beyond just like that you would want to share with us? I would benefit from if there are specific mitigation pathways for rural communities that relate to cross-sector transportation in particular for Gina and I that you could share with us, and then we could have a conversation. That would be very helpful. Frankly, I saw some of it come up when I looked at the public engagement collateral. I was like, oh, I get more. So it'd be very helpful to have that sooner rather than later, because we're not thinking of these things in isolation. We're thinking of it all together. But if there's something, Marian, you could share, that'd be great.
Mm-hmm.
I actually would, I'd like to challenge that a little bit and suggest that what should happen is that your actions should go to them, and there should be some thought process and synthesis, and then they can come back and you can have a conversation. But I really, it is very clear in the statute that this falls under their purview. And so it was written into their, I can't remember what we called it right now, but the scope of work, the charters for each of the subcommittees. And rural resilience clearly has this. I think that this has been a flawed process for them to independently try to come up with ideas. They should be thinking about application and implementation in the rural landscape, and I'm mindful of that. But maybe now that your actions are out there and Marian and I have them, we should probably have a conversation with that group. People can come in if they want to, and it's part of the cross-cutting ideas and themes that we need to deal with and figure out how to coordinate better around this in process. And I put in the chat that I firmly agree that you're probably right that this is not phrased correctly in the outline as mitigation pathways for rural communities. It should be some synthesis of application or implementation. Christine?
Actually, I'm in the process of lowering my hand. You basically said what I was going to say, Jane. Yeah.
Okay, good. Like when that happens. One other thing is, I had a really great conversation actually about this with TJ Poor yesterday at the AN Summit, but a recognition that EFG and Cadmus can likely provide us with some really good summaries that we can be including, rather than having to take their reports and try to synthesize ourselves into these components of the CAP. And so in our check-in later this week with them, tomorrow I have a talk with them, I intend to think about how it's framed in their contract already, and how we are able to utilize components of their technical reports to just sort of plug them right into the CAP with these shorter sections that reference the longer reports. So hopefully we'll be able to get there. And that's happy to pause here with all of this and any thoughts, and then we can look at the timeline if you'd like.
If I may make a suggestion, Jane, riffing off what you just said, and if we could maybe scroll up to the thermal building sector, just as an example. I mean, when I first saw this architecture here, this makes a lot of sense. And where my head went was, how about Dave and I, at a certain point, pass over the narrative document that we, with Brian's help, have been building for quite some time, some of which has landed in the spreadsheet, but there's a whole separate narrative we've been working on. It's not long, but it's written in sentences, not in cells, and pass that over along with this outline to Cadmus EFG and said, inform us on what more you would add given all of the research and analysis that you've done in the building sector as part of your contract. In fact, that's sort of what I think part of what we were asking them to do when we wrote the RFP and reviewed their proposal. So I would hope that there's a heavy dose of Cadmus and EFG in this document, at least for the buildings thermal sector, because they're very expert in that sector.
That's great. I had not envisioned that myself yet, but I certainly think you're right, especially in the gap analysis and the way they've been thinking about how to provide additive clarity to the work that's coming out of cross-sector. So I'd love to think about how they could actually write the summary statements or support the drafting of the summary statements for the sectors that they're helping to analyze. And if others would like that as a starting place with them, I'm certainly happy to think about with them as we're thinking about their statements down here and what they can contribute towards the report summaries that we would put in here.
But just to drill down a little bit, going back up to buildings, I mean, coming out of their modeling work, I would assume they're going to know, David Hill and Mimi and Faisy are going to know off the top of their head what should be implemented in 22, 23, what should be done by 24, 25. I mean, Dave Farnsworth and I would be guessing, I mean, with all due respect. And I just can't imagine why we wouldn't engage them at that level. I mean, the modeling conversation we had with them last week was the highest level hour conversation I've experienced in this whole process around the buildings thermal. They're deep in thinking about how much needs to happen by when, and I would imagine the LEAP modeling will take them even deeper. So Dave and I are hovering at the top, doing the best we can, but they're deep inside it. So I won't say it again, but I can't imagine doing it any other way than that way. That's why we've got them, I thought.
So you're suggesting that in their work is the basis for the prioritization, essentially?
Informed by the pre-level prioritization that we've been working on, and we've said, many times over in many different formats, but not limited by it.
Yep. That's great.
At least in the buildings thermal sector, because they're very solid in that sector. I don't think there's any dispute about that.
Yeah, Christine, I would just add to that while their knowledge of the specific pathways and components that are going to make actions in the building sector possible is incredibly valuable. You and Dave and others have been working to understand all of the components around this, not just the logistics of how do we make the math work. And so I think that prioritization is, as you engaged in it, because of the breadth of the work that you've done. And so I wouldn't downplay your involvement. I don't think it's just a math game, right? From what we've learned from Cadmus and EFG. And that's where I do think we add value as task leads and participants, that we may not think that we have any more to offer than what they do, but we certainly do, because you've been having those conversations for the past 6 months around how to make these things work.
Oh, sure. No, I recognize that. But in this particular sector, I mean, I know that threesome really well. I've worked with them. And they also know much more than the math. And they know how to design and implement programs effectively and how to stage them up so that they'll have the intended impacts. And they know how to write and think about that stuff. So anyway, I've made my point. Thank you for indulging me.
Ready to look at timeline?
Can I just ask one question with the
Sure.
writing assignment? It looks very easy the way it's laid out, pathway, strategy, action, but won't there need to be some discussion in the beginning, sort of setting the stage? Here's what the situation is today in Vermont. I'm thinking just of transportation right now because that's what I have to do. Here's where we are. Here's where we want to go, using the modeling, which is the big picture. That's going to help inform the pathways, but those don't dictate the pathways, what the modeling produces. So we're going to have some kind of a mini outline for this introductory part of our discussion, unless that happens somewhere else in the document. I don't think it is going to. Just throwing it out there. Sort of setting the stage around our sectors.
Yep, there were summary statements. I thought that is what we were sort of talking about with Christine too, about how and if Cadmus and EFG, especially in the building space, could help support the drafting of that. But yes, there are summary statements at the beginning of each sectoral contribution and cross-sector that allow for the space to set the stage.
Okay, so we will be involved in writing that and drafting that too. Could be a page or two.
Your names are next to it. Yep.
I just didn't see that. I just didn't see that in the outline. Okay, got it.
Yep.
Good. Thank you.
Okay. Sorry, 1 second. That's popping up. Okay, so I won't bore you with the details of this, but so that you have it, it is online. I'll drop the link, or maybe while I'm talking, Marion can drop the link in the chat. I have added one section that Jared rightfully pointed out was an oversight, that I didn't include the number. So it probably, actually, Marion, I should say it should be updated because I've added that now since the council meeting. But right now, the next few weeks are largely around setting the expectation with subcommittees as well as the council that documents will be sent to the council 1 full week ahead of the meeting in which they will be discussed, so that council members will be able to come ready to have read those documents and provide comments. That way, oral comments can be received on drafts in different components at the meeting. There'll be 2 days after the council meetings for written feedback, and then 1 week after those written comments, there'll be an expectation that the revised drafts will be provided. So you all have for the October 5th meeting the intent that the comprehensive list of your pathway strategies and actions will be sent out ahead of time on September 28th to council members, recognizing that when you walk through the body of work of cross-sector at October 5th, you won't present every single action, since that would take a lot of time. So the idea would be that, similarly to how you did in July, you would highlight key strategies and the key actions needed to implement them, and then be able to reference the document that they would all have access to, so that you would be flagging the ones that you expect would warrant conversation at the council, but they would have had the chance to flag any other gaps, red flags, and questions for those meetings. The same schedule sort of prevails down below. So you'll see that on October 19th, the cross-sector final work will be shared with the council. So that doesn't mean just spreadsheets. That means the sections that you are responsible for drafting will be fully drafted by October 19th and shared with the council. And then on October 26th, there'll be another set of discussion around your final body of work, as well as the economic modeling that will be presented, and comments back. And then by early November, you guys will be sort of done with your cross-sector components of the CAP. So that all of their other sections in here, all of those, the dates, the executive summary, different components of the CAP are all fleshed out now here in a timeline. It really gives me, it kind of takes my breath away. I'll just say it's extremely tight timeline, and the real comprehensive CAP outline, which you might have heard in the BPR story that ran this morning, a long story about this. The comprehensive CAP won't be put together and distributed till November 23rd. But if we have done a good job of having all those sections reviewed and revised and synthesized ahead of time, the comprehensive CAP won't be a large surprise at that point for the counselors. So December 1st will be the day that we adopt the initial plan. I like to set the expectation. I do not expect this plan to look gorgeous on December 1st. It won't be copy edited yet. None of that stuff will happen until the winter, but it will be comprehensive and it will have all of your work in it. So that's the plan as of now. I'll share the timeline if it isn't in the chat from Marion, and then also share the detailed CAP outline with you all, recognizing that it's evolving a bit ahead of next Tuesday's steering committee, but we hope to have a pretty final one soon.
Thanks, Jane. Will you just email that to us or share it some other way?
Yep, we'll do.
I just posted it in the chat. I just need to update it based on Jared's comment from the meeting, but
Great.
minor. So it's there for online for folks.
Very helpful for all of us to have that and see that, as terrifying as it is.
Yeah. Christine, your hand's still up, or is that an old hand?
No, it's a new hand. I'm sorry. I don't mean to be dominating, but I'm trying to listen at an operational level to understand clearly what the assignment is for somebody like me next out of all of that really needed architecture for the bigger process. But so for building/thermal, I think you use the term list of pathway strategies and actions that we want the council to really focus on, due by 9/28. Is that right, Jane? So that would be like the next material deadline for somebody like Dave and me. So list, are you implying a narrative? Are you implying a narrative document or a PowerPoint?
Yeah, so my understanding expectation, it will be the Excel spreadsheets that you all have now worked on or are close to being done with all together. And then there will be a PowerPoint that will be assembled similarly to the one that was put in July that highlights different components of different sectors that you choose to put forward.
So our deliverable due 9/28 is a PowerPoint that highlights buildings, thermal, pathway strategies and actions. And then the more detailed document that you said would be referenced is the spreadsheet.
Yeah, the spreadsheet is what's due on September 28th. And then the PowerPoint will be the means for delivering the message to the council on October 5th.
Okay. Do you need to see the PowerPoint before we deliver it on the 5th? Somebody other than the council?
In an ideal world, that PowerPoint would be distributed and posted on the 28th also. That way folks can see the issues that you're flagging for the council in particular. But I do expect that as long as they have the comprehensive list, that there could be a few days if you needed your final meeting on the 30th ahead of the 5th to like run through the PowerPoint and stuff.
And so you're going to be sending to the council ahead of the 10/5 meeting that spreadsheet? That's what you're calling the list? And you think they're going to read it? Okay, all right.
I'm going to be able to say that you had the chance to.
Okay, all right, that's fine. Thank you. I'm just trying to be clear.
Yeah.
That's super clear. Thank you.
All right.
It might be, Jane, it might be great at the end of this to sort of summarize in an email to, as we're sharing around minutes, summarizing precisely what the requirements are for each task lead and the timeline, just at least in the next period of time. Just to, we can keep going back to that.
That's a great idea. And I will commit to doing that in an email this afternoon to you all, so it's clear.
Thank you.
Joey, and then we need to move on.
Yeah, no, I wanted to ask something similar. So thanks for asking that, Peter. Appreciate you doing that, Jane. I also just wanted to, sort of invite, fellow counselors to, if there is more information or resources that they love on like a particular topic, if those of us, like, for example, Gina and I in the transportation arena, if people want to go deeper into a topic, or I just, I feel like there's a lot to unpack in the council meetings themselves, but so if there's any sort of concerns or interests, or there more resources that would be helpful proactively to offer people, I just want to put that out there, that, so that we can ground ourselves to the best of our ability in some of these fairly complicated things, because we will have limited time collectively. And then I just wanted to underscore what Jared in the chat is asking in terms of when we're talking about buildings, we're talking about like sort of buildings and either fuel use or like just like recognizing some sort of more clear way of describing what we're talking about, which is like sort of the thermal envelope or something. And then Judy Dow has a question in the chat. I'm wondering if you can answer, Jane.
Thanks, Judy, for that question. We spoke to this at the beginning of the meeting, but maybe you joined late or it wasn't clear enough, but I'm happy to reiterate that the equity consultant is coming on board this week. We have a plan and process to meet with the co-chairs next Wednesday to flesh out how the work is going to unfold with subcommittees in their application of the scoring rubric. We're starting to think a bit about how and when which actions will be utilized in consult with the consultant. So how to sort through what actions the subcommittee will spend substantive time working on with the consultant. But that is all getting fleshed out as the consultant comes on board next week. And my understanding and expectation is the next topic on the agenda today is going to be a little bit of that pre-work and discussion to sort through as a cross-sector mitigation subcommittee some of the ideas that they want to put forward even before the consultant is on board.
Thanks, Jane. Well, and we're past time, but we should begin that conversation right now. In the agenda for today, we have listed a number of questions for task leads as we stated at the beginning of this meeting, and as Jane just restated, we're beginning the conversation now to make sure that we are prepared to test mitigation policies against equity considerations and mitigation opportunities. And that, I know that's already been a part of everybody's frame from the very beginning, but what we'd like to do in the next few minutes here with the committee is ask each of the task leads to, begin that process out loud with us all, answering the questions that were listed in the agenda. And as listed in the agenda, electricity, Liz, you're first.
Yeah, I don't think Ed was able to join us, and I'm actually scrambling, Richard, so this might be a general conversation before we go sector by sector. You let me know what you think. I'm scrambling as we speak to have on my screen, I've got 1,500 things on my screen, probably like all of you, the most recent and adopted Just Transitions Guiding Principles in order to have this conversation effectively. because my memory is very clear that frontline and impacted communities are defined well in that document. And I don't want to start the conversation, especially as a less experienced, I have not been on that subcommittee. I want to make sure that I'm driving that conversation through the document that we adopted. So the question is, do you believe we should make sure that's up in front of all of us and a part of the discussion? And if so, can we put it in the chat link or something? Because I'm looking for it, given that we changed websites.
Jane or Marion, can you do that?
Yep,
for
I can do it. Mhm.
It's probably linked in our Climate Council agenda from Tuesday, right? Is that
Yep.
the best place to get
Yes.
it?
Yeah,
Okay,
I'm
great.
I'm there on the page. Give me 1 second to copy it.
Thanks for that suggestion
Okay.
to ground us, Liz. I think that's a good one.
Good. Okay, great. I, especially realizing that electricity was listed first, was looking at our matrix, our suggested pathways, strategies, and actions, and trying to figure out how best to utilize all of you to start this conversation with the electric sector. And I think, I'm just going to throw it out there, that of our essentially 3 pathways, which, as a reminder, one is increasing the res. The second is promoting electrification as a part of overall fuel switching away from fossil fuels. And the third is essentially using electricity and generating electricity in ways that help further reduce GHGs and also control costs. So that's a simpler way of trying to say load control and efficiency, which includes rate design and other things. That's a lot, and it's going to be, I think, like for all of you, a process to apply this lens and make sure that we're doing a thorough job of describing the impacts and benefits. For today, I thought probably electrification for all, or that I thought that pathway might be a good one to start with for all of us in terms of thinking about the questions here. So unless I get like, I don't know, shaking heads, I guess, that's the one I would suggest that we talk about just for a minute or two. Is that okay? Okay, great. So if we consider that for a moment, it might be helpful if I just really briefly frame it, and then we can talk about a couple of these questions. Is that okay? And Jane, I don't know if I'm doing this right, or Peter and Richard, is that okay to do it that way?
Keep going.
Okay, great. Okay, so enable Vermonters to choose to switch to electricity from fossil fuels for heating and transportation. And obviously that's complementary to other fuel switching. The strategies, again, high level, provide financial and technical assistance for Vermonters to upgrade electric service at their homes and businesses and to purchase and install necessary equipment. And then the actions involve both enhancements or bolstering of current programs, of which there are already many, like heat pump incentives, et cetera, along with potentially a new program that would, in coordination with other efforts, develop a way for Vermonters to access 200 amp service upgrades, addressing both the cost and the workforce issues that would come from that. So I'm just going to put that summary out there, and then using that with our questions. The first one, I think, is, if I remember correctly, how does it impact frontline? And
that's correct. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think, I'll just ask others for feedback. I think it's all about ensuring that the access to any additional program for electric upgrades is equitably created, particularly with a lens on income for any cost support, as well as workforce training and workforce availability. Obviously that gets to, if I'm looking at the list here, we're going to need electricians, and we're going to need them throughout the state in order to do this. And we're going to need a level of coordination with many, but including, I would say, our CAPs and electric utilities and efficiency utilities to ensure that Vermonters can access these programs. But I actually would like some help in thinking through where people especially see pitfalls, not how it can be helpful, because I think that part Ed and I will be able to more easily identify, but where do you see the pitfalls? In other words, the potential impacts and places where we may not meet our goals in terms of equity with this particular program.
Hey, Liz, this is Ed. Just want to let you know I
Oh, great.
am on.
Hi.
And I just want to add one more thing before Peter and Bram jump in as well, which is I think number 1 and 2 of the equity considerations are very well tied together in terms of number 2 is how could the design and funding of this recommendation ensure that the benefits are shared or targeted to help frontline and impact communities. And I think there's different ways of implementing this recommendation. One way would actually be have an income qualifier. And so, which is how I had been thinking about it, at least. We still need a little bit coordination between Liz and I on this, obviously, but if it is really just targeted towards low income, that actually helps address number 1 as well. Low, maybe moderate income up to a certain point, but I don't, at least I would have trouble recommending incentives for, upgrading the panel for your McMansion,
Yeah.
so
Right, financial incentives.
yeah, exactly. So I think those are sort of tied together, and I just want to throw that out there. I'm guessing that's going to be the case for a lot of the actions that we talked through today. Peter?
I want to put in a plug for, and I've had a couple of these conversations off and on with sort of the lenders who take an interest in this work, like VSECU and others, that oftentimes it's about the delivery model for these types of services that really matter. It's trying to balance, so there can be cash available, but if individuals have to figure out how to do the electricity upgrade, how to get their GMP free level 2 charger and all these things at once, it's while at the same time purchasing a new or used electric vehicle and that sort of thing. It's kind of overwhelming, even for somebody like me with capacity and knowledge around the subject. I just think that we should be really thoughtful about how the partnership opportunities that are here that are about where our impacted and frontline communities engage with who they engage with, right? If they're operating through their bank to pursue a loan, or if they're operating through a dealer or some sort of car sales arrangement, like that's the point of entry we should try to utilize and try to understand, rather than simply sort of making money available through a separate but complicated path. And so I just want to think about program coordination as a huge opportunity here, to really where we see the true benefits start to shift.
So Peter, I think that's a great point. I'm actually really interested in learning a little bit more. I haven't had the time yet, but I know the CAPS are deploying sort of this energy coach idea, to actually help and to aggregate some of that. So you're not going to, exactly as you said, 15 different websites to try to figure out how they all actually tie together. And that's one where I think the funding for the CAPS probably makes some sense. And I think that's a cross-cutting. And again, I think that's going to apply for a lot. That concept's going to apply to a lot of the different actions in cross-sector as well. Incentives for EVs, incentives for heat pumps and all that. Like, yes, it's relatively straightforward to just go to GMP's website or whoever's website, but then what all the additional steps, as you said. So completely agree with you on that.
Yeah, we haven't talked a lot about sort of the ecosystem of delivery in a lot of these programs, but they are totally related, and that energy coach or concierge sort of turnkey kind of help is so incredibly important to actually getting projects done.
Thanks, Peter. Bram?
Thanks. As I think about the frontline impacts from electrification, one of the things I think about is the people who are whose work is going to be displaced by electrification. As an example, as we install a bunch of heat pumps and people stop buying heating oil, there is the local heating oil distributor who's, a couple of people and a couple of trucks maybe. And, to Liz's point, we're going to need electricians. And I think, to the extent that we can be thoughtful and proactive in planning the transition of people from being heating oil distributors to being electricians and the training that they'll need and planning the economics so that their personal finances aren't disrupted by that, it will work a lot better. And I'm sorry, I would just add, use heating oil distributors as an example, but there are also all the gas stations. As you electrify cars, people are stopping less often, and they're losing the sales of the gasoline, but they're also losing the sales of the coffee and beer and whatever else people buy when they stop. So I think the distributors and the infrastructure and the economic infrastructure that is currently supported by gas-powered cars, how we carefully help all the people working in that industry transition to clean energy jobs is going to be important.
Thanks, Bram. I'll skip over myself for now and go to Jared.
It's possible that I should wait. I wanted to offer an observation with regard to that second bullet point, Liz, and I'm not sure if we're on the second or third one in terms of promoting electrification or the kind of load control and efficiency pieces. But if it's fuel switching is appropriate now, happy to say, share an observation, or to wait until later if we're not there yet.
I just will do it. It feels like a lot of this stuff cross cuts to me.
Yeah, I think we're going to end up, two ideas that have been touched on already. The energy coach idea, that, what is the consumer supportive delivery mechanism that would help folks make this transition, cuts across a lot of our issue areas, and workforce development cuts across our issue areas. I was going to make the comment just on the electrification for all strategy, that particular attention needs to be paid to apartment buildings, multifamily housing projects, that kind of thing, both on the heating side and on the electric transportation charging infrastructure. And I know you're aware of that, but if we don't design policies that have program elements specifically for that kind of housing stock, then I think we're really missing the boat.
I'd add mobile as well. I agree with you, Richard.
Yeah.
And both of those are equity lens considerations that Ed and I identified. Yeah.
Do we have other comments on? I recognize we only have we've got a half hour to consider all of this. As again, we're just teeing up these terrific questions for further work. But is there more that you'd like to go through?
I wasn't sure if Jared finished, so I didn't know if Jared actually finished his comment. Did he? Sorry.
No, I didn't even start it. Sorry, I was asking if I should share. So what I want.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Jared, because I didn't know if you're talking about transportation or buildings.
Well, I'm talking about the kind of electrification for all, the fuel switching, which I recognize, at least what I'm about to share is cross-cutting with transportation. But I do want to highlight that I think one of the biggest opportunities we have, but it will not happen on its own, and it speaks to what Ed was talking about in terms of the importance of incentive design, is the significant cost savings that are possible. I just put a link in the chat. The significant cost savings that are possible with electric vehicles versus fossil vehicles in terms of operations and maintenance and fueling. We actually have an incredible resource that just came out earlier this year, the Union of Concerned Scientists, studied specifically 4 different states, wanting to understand rural states in particular, and added up on average the different costs related to fuel, operations, and maintenance of driving electric vehicles versus driving fossil vehicles, and found on average in Vermont that rural Vermonters stand to save $1,500 a year driving an electric vehicle versus a fossil vehicle. I think the biggest challenge, so that could be a major help to many Vermonters' budgets, $1,500 a year in savings. I think the challenge is that unless we get the incentives targeted to lower income folks, and in the delivery, making sure that it's not just available to them, but reaching our lower income neighbors, we run the risk of just kind of a business as usual exacerbation of, you know, the people who have the upfront capital to get the new vehicle that costs them less to operate and maintain, saving money on energy, and lower income neighbors continuing to drive very inefficient, costly to maintain fossil vehicles. I think there is some good, there's some encouraging information in this space. I'm going to share another link, which is, I know Christine is very familiar with. We had a great piece of research, a white paper delivered this summer by an EAN intern, Ellie Curtis, who looked at where the electric vehicle incentives are currently going, and found that this is encouraging. I don't think we're as far as we want to be, but at least it's a start, that 59% of the state incentives are going to folks. So more than the majority of incentives are going to folks who are making less than $50,000 a year. So the current incentives are starting to reach some of our low to moderate income Vermonters, but it's not there enough. And I just think it's worth flagging. There is a huge opportunity to reduce the energy burden, the transportation cost burden through electric vehicles, but it's not going to happen on its own. And so I just really want to reiterate what Ed said around incentives that are kind of income sensitized, income targeted. And you know, that it's not just about electric vehicles. I do think that this, it's all electrics, it's PHEVs. You know, I think the Mileage Smart program has been really encouraging that Capstone is running. I mean, if we just look on average in a year in Vermont, 100,000 vehicles are purchased. About 2/3 of them are used and only about 1/3 are new. So we know that we have to have an increasing share of those new vehicle sales be electric. But, you know, those 2/3 that are used, you know, are generally purchased by lower and middle income Vermonters. And so we've got to find a way through our incentives and programs and policies to make sure that those savings opportunities from EVs are reaching them as well, since they're less likely to be buying new vehicles.
Thanks, Jared. Liz and Ed, do you have other topic areas you want to put in front of us?
From a time point of view, we should move on. It would be great if another sector took on at some point the 5th question, just because I think that thinking would be helpful to us, which is the data or information collection in order to track and measure equity impacts. Yeah, I can think of ways where that would apply to what we just talked about in terms of numbers deployed and to whom, but it would be great to hear that conversation when it comes to, say, buildings next.
Yeah, I do want to just give a plug, though, that we need to consider where the funding for the different programs are coming, and how anybody who hasn't read EVT's Efficiency Vermont's energy burden study, I think the last one was maybe 2 years ago or so, that's well worth reading. And one concern is funding coming from a more progressive tax structure or something that ends up being more regressive of an impact on low-income Vermonters. And so thinking about where funding for different incentives and program is coming from, I think is really important from an initial start with from an equity framing.
Yeah, Ed, thank you for raising that. If we had started with the RES, for example, which is funded through electric ratepayer, rate design, which is by its nature not a progressive way of doing it, we could have talked about that more. And I was going to mention on that one some of the federal discussion on clean energy and potentially grants for some of that would actually provide a different framing, which would be not only more progressive because it would be broadly based federal, but also beneficial directly to Vermonters. It's a good framing. Okay.
But let's take up transportation next, if that's okay.
Thanks, but I have to get my husband down to UVM Medical and I have to leave at 1:30, so we can start on it. Joey, how do you want to do this? We could put up our list of actions, and you can see how we've thought about equity issues in those actions and how much further we might be able to go. Does that make sense, Joey?
Yes. Yeah, we can do that. I don't know if you want me to share my screen. I don't know if I can do that, or if we just want to take one.
Or we could just walk through them. I think it's easier for people if they can look at something and we're not just talking.
I would encourage you to think about an example. I mean, a lot of these you've seen are cross-cutting. So if there are one that you can use an example that you think starts to illustrate the challenges in the transportation space, probably better than going through your whole list. That way we can have a conversation where we're all looking at each other.
Yeah, well, there's one fundamental issue for us, and that is, electrification is easy to measure. And what we're concerned about is that for people who can't afford or can't, for whatever reason, own a car, and those are usually very often people of low income and have other challenges in their lives, by just going with EVs, we are keeping them out of our conversation. So we need to look at alternative modes. We need to continue, for many humanitarian reasons, continue looking at alternative modes, but we also need to bake that into this climate plan. And so how we've talked about replace your ride, and we've talked about mileage smart, and we've talked about supporting transit. But what are we going to do when we hit this train wreck of, oh my gosh, electrification is the way to go because we can measure that and it makes so much sense. I'm just throwing that out there. It's sort of a big issue in the transportation sphere that we've talked about and we've danced around.
Well, you can also think about it more broadly, right? Because if one of our strategies is smart growth and communities that are thriving where people are not having to drive as much, the benefits to that for all in that community are incredibly significant and well beyond the value of the climate components. And so how we value those co-benefits is a significant portion of our equity considerations as we're thinking about rural and low-income communities in that process.
Are we going to be able to quantify that now? I don't think.
I don't think we can. There are lots of things we can't quantify about this equity conversation.
Yeah. Well, the health issues around smart growth, for instance. And,
I was going well beyond the health, components of it, right? And the fact that there are direct economic benefits to the communities that are there, and the job opportunities that follow, and all those things that are real and aren't unrelated to the climate benefit.
So for some reason, I tried to paste a couple of things here and it pasted a couple of random things. I would just remind folks that in general, some of the things where recommendation is that we are leading with is recommending vehicle electrification as a core component. At the same time, recommending programs that support and enable more enhanced vehicle efficiency. So building off of existing programs like Mileage Smart and Replace Your Ride, which we've talked about, that are critical programs that are still pretty new, nascent, and also even in the short amount of time, like Mileage Smart working, and those are serving an overburdened, network of Vermonters. And we're recommending, for example, that program that gets people into more fuel efficient vehicles as a transitional program will be really important. We're also recommending, for example, expanding EV charging infrastructure, like using federal ARPA dollars, potentially federal stimulus dollars to make strategic investments, including, as you see here, really trying to focus in on where those places, multifamily facilities, workplace charging, et cetera, that would prioritize, and be put in places where that might serve, again, more overburdened, underserved communities. So again, thinking about vehicle electrification and how we begin to build and expand the market so that we can get more clean electric vehicles into people's hands, but then also build a market where we can bring more used electric vehicles onto the market so that lower income, overburdened, underserved Vermonters can access electric vehicles. And then at the same time, while that it's going to take a bit of time to do that, expanding those programs that we have capacitized a bit already, including, again, Mileage Smart and Replace Your Ride, and looking at sort of setting the stage for greater electrification and greater access and EVs into the hands, and electric buses and transit systems into communities and into the hands of Vermonters, by investing in the infrastructure that we know we're going to need to make this a more efficient, affordable, accessible system for everyone. That's sort of how we're thinking about it. And I guess I'm looking forward to what do we need to do potentially, what can we do to modify existing programs, or what like Mileage Smart or Replace Your Ride to better serve some of the constituencies that the Just Transitions has identified as Vermonters that we really need to prioritize in these programs.
So Joey and Gina, can you've listed and you put in the chat a recommendation about TCI.
Yep.
And can you articulate a bit the equity impacts of that and how TCI can be tailored to meet the objectives Joey was just talking about?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. But Peter, do you have a question or clarifying point, knowing we have little time?
Yeah, I just want to flag for everybody. I think we oftentimes use low income as a stand-in for equity, and that's not the extent of it. And we need to be careful that we're not just using a sort of income screen as an eligibility template as the solution. I think it is engaging with communities who have less access to things, not necessarily because they're solely in low-income communities, or that, whether that's the energy coaches with different language training or access to different resources in different languages and things like that are critically important if we're going to be successful here. So just, I know we all have that in our mind, and we just want to make sure we don't sort of fall into that trap of the income screen being sufficient.
Absolutely.
But the income screen is really, really important.
Peter, thanks. And and Gina,
for the rural poor, it's a really big deal.
Well, one thing I think I very much appreciate that, and I couldn't agree more, Peter. So thank you for putting a finer point on it. Maybe one way to answer that in terms of the question you just asked about TCI, Rich. So TCI, Transportation Climate Initiative, regional program, Cap and Invest program that some of our neighboring states are participating in, that is essentially an allowance-based system which would raise some revenue from the cost of compliance for the wholesalers, and the wholesalers would likely pass that cost on. The initial outset of the program, that could be something along the lines of about 5 cents a gallon of gas on Vermonters if that cost is passed on. What it would also do is create $20 million of annual revenue for the state of Vermont to invest in and expand these programs. One of the ideas that we have put forward is the Transportation and Climate Initiative MOU essentially creates a floor in terms of requirements related to equity, and states like Massachusetts, for example, are going further. The MOU creates an equity board, which we would recommend the state of Vermont advances a complementary policy that expands the equity board that comprises that board of more diverse voices. The the sort of lower income, BIPOC, more overburdened, underserved communities that you just noted, Peter. And that board helps to identify the programs and the places that we should drive TCI revenues to support. And again, Massachusetts goes further than the existing MOU, and they have 2 bills introduced that would drive, a significant portion of TCI revenues into lower income, overburdened, underserved communities. And that's the type of strategy that we are recommending the state explore and embrace, to go further than the TCI MOU requires, to really get at the equity outcomes that we want to ensure and enshrine. And that would be informed, again, by putting people that we have identified in the Just Transitions principles and in the rubric into a place of leadership and greater direction over where the investments would go.
Thanks, Joey. I think we need to move on to buildings because of the time on the agenda. Jared, do you have something more on transportation?
Just really quickly, I do think that when we have the TCI and equity conversation, one important thing to do is to dissociate what we have control over versus what we do not. And one of the things that I remember hearing, and Peter, please add to this because you have more of the direct information, but I know that there were interviews of regional fuel suppliers, and they were asked, if the TCI program is implemented, do you foresee that that fuel prices would increase across the board regionally, or that you would be differentiating by state? And the testimony that was, or the feedback that was received is, it's a regional fuels market. And so if you have a number of states join the program, which has already happened, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, that the entire region is likely to see some minimal fuel price increase passed along via the program. And so it's entirely possible that Vermonters could see, 3 or 4 cents per gallon increase related to the implementation of TCI by other states, regardless of whether or not we join. So I just want to make sure that we are using good information and data and don't use a potential fuel price increase as a red herring about not to join when it's potentially likely to happen regardless of our participation in the program.
And I thank you for that, Jared. And I just would note, many of the things that we're recommending either require a significant shift in the way we prioritize our transportation investments. We should certainly use the federal funds that are coming down through ARPA and potentially an infrastructure bill, or we're going to need, probably to raise new revenue streams. And again, the TCIP program is one of those potential revenue streams on an annual basis that could actually provide the funding that we need to capacitize the programs that we have identified. And we recommend prioritizing, looking at the list that the Just Transition Subcommittee has put forward under the rubric, those frontline impacted, underserved BIPOC communities.
All right. Joey and Gina, thank you. Moving on to buildings.
Thanks, Rich. So the recommendations, discussions I'm going to provide you all have been developed by me and Christine, and Brian Wood's been a big help with this. They're going to be weighing in. I'm going to run with this. If it's okay, I'd like to talk about this from the perspective of the recommendations. I'm happy to respond to specific questions about from the point of view of the guiding questions. I'd also like to start with a caveat. It's obvious, but I think it's important to start with. I'm a privileged white male, not the member of an overburdened and underserved community. I do not have firsthand knowledge of those communities, frankly. I've gotten no feedback from members of those communities with respect to the work I've done, or very little feedback. While we're recommending that the subcommittee endorse these 2 recommendations, weatherization at scale and a clean heat standard, we think that those will help Vermonters reduce their use of fossil fuels. these communities really need to see this. They need to kick the tires on what we're doing. And I just want to know that, that we recognize that. We also recognize that affordability and fairness, they're essential elements of whatever mitigation policies we would propose. Hopefully this entire group would propose. Given the quality of buildings, the cost of fuel, the number and the income status of Vermonters who rent, and those whose livelihoods are connected with the current ways that buildings are heated and cooled, it's critical that social equity is reflected in these recommendations. Global Warming Solutions Act building related solutions will need to minimize adverse effects on low-income households and those most burdened by high energy bills. And I want to recognize, and I agree with what Peter's observation was about LMI, although I may be using that terminology here and there. Vermont has about 330,000 homes, 80,000 of them are prepared for rent. A large portion of Vermonters that rent, roughly 80% of them, are categorized as low income, according to Efficiency Vermont, the Vermont Housing Finance Agency. 1/4 of all renters pay between 30 to 49% of their income for housing. 1/4 of renters pay over 50% or more of income for housing. That includes rent and the cost of utilities. So housing burden and energy burden, what's paid for these things as a percentage of income is a critical, equitable concern. Energy burden Vermonters are at risk of any policy or program that fails to take their precarious position in mind. So our first recommendation, weatherization at scale. It's a portfolio of approaches. The first, it basically focuses on ameliorating building efficiency with a special focus on LMI customers. Funding for weatherization, finding additional funding. There are a number of approaches that this group has been seeking out. Financing, looking at different ways of financing investment. For example, tariff on bill financing, where the upfront costs of more efficient appliances would be absorbed by a program, and that the cost would go to the meter, so to speak, and not to the individual, so they wouldn't be burdened with that debt. Workforce development is another big part of that. That involves local hiring and training. It also involves recognizing that workers are at risk of displacement from this energy transition, and that there's a need to ensure that the transition's fair to them as well. Points that Bram just made very clearly. Consumer counseling is part of that. A rental efficiency standard to support and educate landlords to make efficiency improvements in their properties is another approach here. So as you can see, this weatherization at scale, this cluster of policies or actions, I guess, using our terminology, it's all focused on vulnerable Vermonters. It's heavily focused on them, and we think that's a very important step to take. Our second recommendation is a performance standard to transition the delivery of fuels and consumption of fuels to reduce their carbon content. That's the clean heat standard. It's conceptual at this point. A group has put together a great paper that describes how that program would work, recommends that the Utility Commission administer that program. It looks a lot like a portfolio standard for delivered fuels, Vermont gas system fuels, and other delivered fuels. It hasn't got to the program development stage that still would need to occur. So I'm talking conceptually here, but even conceptually, the program design recognizes that there's a need to include policies to minimize adverse effects on low-income customers, potentially other customer segments for which there may be equity concerns. Options with the clean heat standard include fuel switching carve-outs. In other words, for every heat pump that would go to most Vermonters, perhaps there would be a more favorable treatment for heat pumps that go to overburdened and underserved communities or LMI customers. Substantial low-income weatherization requirement could be included with that. There are other complementary policies that have yet to be figured out for the clean heat standard, but which would basically support the goals of that standard. That includes improved rate designs from Vermont gas systems to support low-income customers, low-income fuel cost assistance, minimum efficiency requirements for rental properties, which I just mentioned, fee bates for heating equipment. In other words, paying a little bit more for a fossil appliance, and that money would go to supporting other cleaner appliances. Broadening the range of measures that state low-income weatherization applies. So when you're getting weatherization, maybe you'd get some other appliances included in those, like having to do with renewables and heat pumps. So I've just put my running shoes on and just run through this really quickly. I apologize for going so quickly. There's this one last point that I'd like to bring up, which has to do with question 5. Liz raised it earlier. What data or information should be collected to help track and measure impacts on frontline communities? I have a few observations here. They're scattershot, I apologize. First, you need to get the data from communities in the first place. Okay, what do the communities think they need? What's going to work for them? How can they be included? Instead of looking at how many postcards have been sent out to tell people about programs, focus on the uptake in programs. How many people were contacted is not so important. Or how many people have access to a time of use rate design, not so important. Or how many people have access to biodiesel or to a heat pump. But instead, how many members of overburdened and underserved communities are benefiting from that weatherization program? What are their reactions? How do they describe the benefits they're experiencing from those programs? How many members of overburdened and underserved communities are traveling with an EV? How many miles are they traveling? How many miles are they traveling with an electric bus? How many of them are traveling with an electric bike? Those sorts of things that reflect actual usage. And obviously data will need to recognize dollars spent, tons avoided. But when the most important data really should reflect those, some people call it a triple bottom line, where you're getting the social information, which is so important to reflect these communities, where you're getting the environmental information, and where you're getting the basic dollars and cents. I'm happy to answer any questions. Sorry to run through that so quickly.
Thanks, Dave. Questions for Dave? Obviously, the design of our programs with respect to the building sector, have to be done in such a way, and from the very get-go, as you pointed out, to ensure equity in implementation.
There's just one aspect of this that I don't think we've called out yet, and it's an area where our focus on greenhouse gas emission reductions and improving equity actually align very nicely. Is just reminding folks that we know that per unit of energy delivered, propane and oil, two greenhouse gas emitting are the most expensive. So anytime we are bringing people off of propane or oil, we're taking them off the single most expensive energy source per unit of energy actually delivered. So that's a positive, undermining the rationale for clean heat standard. Another is that we know through one of the EAN last year summer interns work that Jared mentioned earlier from a different angle. We know from Jenna's work last year that not only to those in the lowest income quintile in Vermont per household comparatively use the least amount of energy, they actually pay the most per unit of energy purchased. They're paying more per unit of energy purchased than those purchasing the same fuel from different higher income categories. So that was a pretty unusual finding from last summer. So that's another way in which, from an equity perspective, transitioning off the fossil fuels can be an equity adder, if you will.
Thanks, Christine. Yeah, and I'm putting a note in the chat just echoing something that Dave said, which is which, and following up on something Peter said, that is targeting programs not just by income, but by being smart and strategic about where the resources are going, can help to enhance equity in a variety of ways. For example, Dave, you've been talking about rental housing as a particular focus. You can design programs that will work very well with the rental housing segment. And if you pay attention to that, the equity implications of that can be quite substantial. Which is something different than identifying individual households by income. There are multiple ways to try to get at equity enhancement in program design. Jared, do you have a final comment before we go to Peter?
Yeah, just quickly on building on what Christine was saying, I think that there is a really important component to highlight in the recommendations here that is directly related to consumer protection. I'll just give an anecdotal example. Last summer, I got in the mail a flyer that was an offer to give me a free propane water heater. Why did that company want to do that? So that they could lock in. A lot of Vermont consumers, I assume, are getting these on the highest cost, most price volatile way to heat water or space. And I think propane is especially problematic, not just because of the high cost and price volatility, but because it is the only fossil fuel that I'm aware of that's used for heating in Vermont, where there is not currently or projected anytime soon to be a lower carbon alternative. Fuel oil, you can use biodiesel, natural gas, there's possibilities to mix in renewable natural gas. So I think we also need to look at equipment standards that would specifically target propane from a consumer protection perspective, but also because if somebody gets locked in on a propane water heater or propane heating system, if we keep adding new fossil fuel systems in buildings, whether they're existing buildings or new buildings, but if people keep purchasing those new pieces of equipment, it's very costly for them, and it could inhibit us from being able to actually meet our climate goals. So I think we need to specifically look at that problem in particular from a consumer protection and lock-in perspective, especially propane.
Thanks, Jared.
So,
Peter, I think we're on to you.
Yeah, thanks. Before we move on to the non-energy piece, and I know we don't have a ton of time, but I do just want to flag, I think, my frustration in this conversation that's about the timing and the access to information from communities that we have. We're doing sort of the classic mistake of tailoring our good ideas to meet communities rather than hearing what communities need and developing solutions there. And I have, real concerns there. Unfortunately, with where we are and the timing of what we're due to deliver, we're not going to be able to do that all that effectively. And I just want us to be cognizant of that. And I know you all are, and I'm not trying to lecture. It's hard to. I think our solutions might be different if we started from a conversation lens, and that about solutions that would meet people where they are, rather than a greenhouse gas emissions lens, and then try to tailor it to those communities who need it most. So it is what it is. In terms of the non-energy pieces, there are a couple that I'm particularly interested in terms of how we address equity. And I want to think sort of at the community scale for equity. So we often, our larger communities have full-time staff, have full-time resources, know how to apply for loans and grants in a much sort of more effective way than our smaller communities. And so we see this a lot in the sort of their infrastructure, whether that be drinking water or wastewater systems, where it's difficult to to maintain those systems, especially as your population shrinking and the size of the community that is paying for those resources gets smaller and smaller. And so as we think about ways to reduce emissions from, say, wastewater treatment facilities and how we target those programs, I want to make sure that we're thinking about providing as much resource and opportunity and sort of turnkey solutions for those communities who just putting together sort of a package of an application may be too much, right? Or maybe a challenge, so that we're not just continuing to funnel resources to those who are quote unquote ready, where it often happens. So that's one, because that just furthers the divide about, and raises the overall cost for all residents of the community, but particularly those who are overburdened. So I just want to think about that as a sort of as something we consider in the sort of implementation side, that there is that sort of kind of what we often call hardship communities in like the water infrastructure world, thinking about how do we get resources there, and not only get resources there, but make sure they come in the door to begin with. And then the other piece that I want to, that one of the things that we're gonna need to do is address refrigeration as a whole, and the chemicals that are used for refrigerants, and what that means to small BIPOC owned community stores and other things that serve as hubs in communities and provide resources in ways that go well beyond sort of your classic store. And how do we help provide all the resources and knowledge that might be available to assist with some of those transitions? Because I think that I want to make sure that as we develop programs, they don't have a chilling effect on the sort of upward mobility and opportunities in communities, so that we're thinking of those things through, that we provide the sort of resources and support. And we often think about the money. We all, I guess I'm going to sound like a bit of a broken record, but we don't provide the wraparound support. And so I think that's a critical piece to how we do any of those things. I know Efficiency Vermont's done a ton of work in this space, but they're, and this is not a critique of Efficiency Vermont, they are looking to create the sort of biggest bang for the buck. But if we thought about how do we hit the hardest to reach folks and those who might have different challenges than a large grocery store, we would have different outcomes and different programs to support. So those are the things that I'm thinking about as we think through the non-energy pieces. Joey?
Yeah, I appreciate what you're putting out there, and I want to echo Jared's thanks to Judy and Donna and others who are putting good comments in the chat. But what you're saying when it relates to non-energy, I'm thinking about as it relates more broadly, to what Jared just was highlighting in terms of like not just the what, but the how, like the moments in time where people are making these decisions, and how do we help them, by working with our fuel provider sector, by working with builders and contractors and architects, as Donna's pointing out, at those critical moments in time. We just pulled out my 40-year-old fuel tank, and, and we're going to go with our weatherization and heat pumps and my wood stove here. And I'm, I'm in this work, but I'm thinking about those moments in time when people are in a crunch moment. How do we help them make those decisions? How do we work with our incredible affordable housing agencies to when people when they are doing their incredible weatherization services and efficiency services and affordable housing projects, that they are building them to net zero? And if there's a gap between what they can do to their high efficiency standards right now and what they would need to do to build those buildings to net zero in this moment, how can we put forward and advance programs and support programs and those kinds of expenditures that close that gap in this moment? I'm saying a lot, but mostly what I'm trying to say is I'm still trying to grapple with not just the what, but the how when it comes to the interface with the consumer. And I am struggling with where we are able to have that conversation. And I think the sort of the equipment change out program that, that came up at your summit yesterday, Jared, and is sort of that moment in time, the interface of like the point of sale where people are making big investments, either in a car purchase, a lease, or a new heat system. I want our programs to be thinking about that and then prioritizing those investments by working closely with the people that like partners that are serving those communities that are most underserved and overburdened. And that's where I feel like we're missing a little bit of that in the conversations as we're talking, sort of the higher level strategies and actions. And I probably not am saying anything new, but I do think that is a fundamental component of the work we have to do.
Thanks, Joey. And I guess I'll just echo a point that Dave Farnsworth made, which is that as we design program elements to meet the objective you just mentioned, we should also design in the metrics by which we would measure success along those lines and ensure that we're actually delivering over time, as opposed to just designing a program that looks like it might work, but without testing whether it actually does work to deliver benefits directly to the communities we're talking about here. So that's just another feature of program design that we need to have in mind. I'm conscious of the fact that we are 10 minutes past our schedule here, and I'd like to open up the floor to public comment. Thank everybody for a really thoughtful engagement on a wide range of challenging issue areas over the past hour. Members of the public who would like to address the committee, somehow let us know.
See Steve,
Steve.
and then Judy.
Okay, Steve.
Hi everybody. Well, this is a great discussion. So many great ideas. It's been fabulous listening in. I want to make a suggestion that might cut across a lot of the different areas here regarding addressing equity. Certainly recognizing that Peter's comment about getting out in front of this without that conversation is critical. And I think that conversation should be a permanent fixture, not just part of this development process. But one of the things that keeps coming up as one of the barriers to equity, an institutional barrier that's developed over many years, is the concept of ownership. And there's a big difference. I mean, you find a huge difference in terms of, how much equity people have in their homes and what kind of wealth people have. And it's generational, and it goes on, and it's community based, and it's your zip code and all that. So to me, that it shows up in a couple of different ways. One is actually being able to own things like community solar. That could be huge for a challenged community to have its own energy supply. But also, particularly, could provide a lot of opportunities in a lot of different areas of things you're talking about, is to think about the ownership of businesses, small businesses, entrepreneurship. To me, this can be one of the great cultural shifts. That's a real dividing line between the old energy economy and the new energy economy. And so what does that mean? Well, maybe it means things like training for people, funding, maybe work with lending institutions to open up for a little risk for supporting small businesses. But to me, it seems like this could be something that fits in a lot of different ways. Obviously things like health insurance and other kinds of insurance are obstacles to entrepreneurship. But there's so many opportunities embedded in all the suggestions you're making that could show up in many places, and help partner with people who have previously not experienced ownership and a stake in the society, and a real a different kind of role than what traditionally goes with inequity, and create a whole new paradigm for participation in society. So that's an opportunity here. So I encourage you in a lot of ways, and maybe the next on this is to talk about this with people in those communities, but think about how those things might happen in all the different areas you're talking about. So thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. Judy.
Hello. Yeah, there were some great comments made today, and I appreciate all of those. And I have several questions as the time went on. So the quote that I think Peter was using when he said 54% of the funding for electric cars were coming from people in middle to low incomes. Do you know that for a fact? And it's not just retired people who now fit into the category of middle to low. Do you actually know they are low to middle? Because I know a lot of people who just retired, and the first thing they did when they retired was buy an electric car. And then on that same line, electricians, for someone who's been married to an electrician for 46 years, I have heard nothing but complaints about, number one, the lack of inspectors, and number two, the licensing process and the lack of educators to get relicensed. And so those will be things that would have to be considered, I'm sure. And I also have a question about, I don't remember how many years, like 10 years ago, maybe, Burlington shut off all the streetlights on the Beltline. Is there a way to save energy by shutting streetlights off, at a certain time, or limiting them in places, shutting them off in places where they're not really needed after a time? And then in the area of transportation, I didn't see any consideration given to hospitality and tourism. I travel often and for work, and I often see the hotel empty out that morning where everybody goes skiing, and that night they all come back and they're out of state license. The next morning they all go skiing again. And I think it would be nice to include hospitality and tourism. Maybe it looks like a tax. Maybe it looks like getting them an electric bus, or having them get electric buses to take these people to the ski areas. And I think that's about it. Oh, no, I do have one more. When we're talking about renters, incentive for landlords to put heat pumps and such into their apartments, will there be some kind of clause or something to limit that increase from being passed on to the rent of the the renters?
Judy, that's a great question, and it has been considered. Dave, do you want to just respond to that, or?
That's a really great point, Judy. You're right, because if you're improving a piece of property, the landlord's going to want to turn around and charge more for it. I think as part of the program design, I think it's worthwhile considering how much requiring a landlord that's taking, for instance, rebates from a program to agree to not raise rents for a period of time to reflect that the landlord's getting benefits by improving his or her property, but is going to not pass that on so the renters can benefit from it as well before the price of the rental unit goes up.
Because many times the rent the heat is included in the cost you rent. And if they do all these increases, these incentives, then they can say to the tenants, hey, look what I did. I saved all of this money, so now I have to raise your rent. And that doesn't do it. That's not equitable, for sure.
Fair point. I agree with you.
And has there been any consideration for hospitality and tourism and including something with that?
Yeah, I can't say that there has been, but I'm going to give it some thought. So I think it's an excellent point. I mean, the example you just gave where all that transportation might be provided in a lower, less polluting way to people coming up to hotels and then going up to the ski hill.
Yeah, it's pretty common. And also, please take into consideration taking a look at the licensure process and the inspection process for electricians before you dump additional work, because the process now, they've had a bill in legislation for 2 years. And so I don't know if it's dead now or what, but they've been asking for help for 2 years already.
Thank you for that, raising that point.
Yeah, I think, Judy, on that last point, workforce development, including for electricians, but also other trades, has to be and is understood increasingly to be essential for implementation of the climate action plan. I mean, it's across the trades generally.
Thank you.
Are there other comments, Donna?
Yeah, just following the discussion about how to involve community groups in neighborhoods. The Habitat for Humanity model is a really good model to think about because it's so much better when you have a community that wants to work together and build community, because doing weatherization can be a way of building communities and getting people together to accomplish things together. And and I think you have to just look at, well, what are the components that can help make that work? A lot of times it's just the cost of materials. Anybody with an old house kind of knows it's like, get over that first hump of getting the materials, get a list of what you need together. And then the expertise is sometimes pretty hard to come by, but then some things can be done without an awful lot of expertise if you just have somebody there who can coach. But I think the Habitat model, where they enlist people from the community to help each other and learn how to do things, it might even help boost participation in workforce training. If somebody does it at the community level, then perhaps they're like, hey, this isn't actually as this isn't bad work. I mean, I could learn to do this. I can get training and help other people. So it might even help some of those people start businesses. But I think doing for people is not a good model. You need to have them participating and learning and helping themselves as well, because there's so much more pride in it. And also, I think, be surprised at the talent the talent you sometimes will find when you just go out into a neighborhood, and people maybe who weren't applying themselves might be very interested in getting involved in this. So definitely reaching out at the community level is going to be very helpful, and help with the supply of the materials, because it's sometimes just for lack of materials that work doesn't get done. And if you can help reduce the cost of those materials some, you can offset that with some involvement in community labor. There's certainly case studies. I mean, years ago, I lived near Philadelphia, and this was a real source of pride in some of the low-income neighborhoods of how they were helping themselves, and renovating old, pretty rundown properties and making them livable and planting gardens in the neighborhood. And it became a total transformation of the neighborhood. And maybe that's what some of our, lower income communities really need right now is not a handout, it's a hand up, right? That's how they put it. Anyway, hope that helps.
Thanks, Donna. We're past time and probably should draw this meeting to a close. Peter, anything further from you?
I'm grateful for this conversation. We've had conversations around these topics, but I think it was a great opportunity to get into them head on. It kind of makes me realize how important that we had this conversation, frankly, first, before we got into all the work with the consultant, because it gives us all a grounding and things to be thinking about as we're working with the consultant to help identify specific programs. So thanks for that. And I appreciate Jane walking through a timeline. Look forward to your email laying those principles and timeline out. And Christine, I was particularly grateful for you asking continued questions to make sure that we all understood what we were supposed to do. Good. It's hard for the presenter to work their way through that, but at the same time, I think it makes sure that we all understand it. So thank you for keeping. All right.
Great comments, Peter. And thanks to everybody for a really good meeting and conversation. See you next time. We're adjourned.
Thanks, everybody.